Let me tell you about Briar Hollow Valley, because if you don't understand the place, you won't understand the people. And if you don't understand the people, you won't understand why a single number read aloud at a county auction made 200 farmers go silent at the same time. Briar Hollow sits in a fold of land about 90 miles from anywhere that matters. No interstate runs through it. No railroad. The nearest town with a traffic light is a 40-minute drive on a 2-lane road that floods in March and buckles in August. The kind of place where the post office closes at noon on Wednesdays, and nobody complains because they know the postmaster's wife has dialysis. The valley runs roughly north to south, about 6 miles long, maybe 2 miles across at its widest. The hills on either side are gentle, rolling, covered in a mix of hardwood forest and old pasture that hasn't seen cattle since the 1970s. And between those hills, running along the valley floor like a crooked spine, is Coldwater Creek, a modest stream, shin deep most of the year, chest deep after the snow melt. The soil on the hillsides is something special, a deep loam, rich and well-drained and slightly alkaline. The kind of soil that makes agronomists go quiet and reverent. And on the south-facing slopes where the sun hits longest and the cold air drains downhill like water, that soil has been growing grapes for over 150 years. The Ashfords were the first family to plant them. 5 generations. Starting sometime around 1860, a man named Ezra Ashford, his son, his son's son, his son's son's son, and then Hollis, each one born on the same hill, each one buried in the same small cemetery behind the Methodist church at the top of the valley, each one devoted to the same crop. The Regent grape, a hardy varietal, disease-resistant. It did well in the valley's particular combination of cool springs and warm summers and soil that held moisture just long enough, but never too long. The Ashfords had 220 acres in total, but the operation, the heart, the thing they lived for and talked about and argued over at Thanksgiving, that was the high field. 185 acres of gently sloping, south-facing hillside that caught the morning sun and held it like a cupped hand. Rows of grapevines running in perfect lines from the tree line down to the access road. Weedless, pruned, immaculate. The remaining acreage was a patchwork. Utility sheds, a gravel access road that needed regrading every spring. The old family homestead with its wraparound porch and its kitchen that smelled permanently of coffee and copper pipe. And then, at the very bottom, wedged between the homestead and the creek like an afterthought, 17.4 acres of bottomland, and that land, that wet, stubborn, sour-smelling, cattail-choked stretch of earth is where the story actually begins. Let me tell you about Hollis Ashford, because you need to understand what kind of man he was before you can understand what his daughter was up against. Hollis was 78 years old in 2019. The year the number got read at the auction. He was 6'2", stooped. Not from age, though age had certainly contributed. He was stooped from 55 years of bending over grapevines, checking the clusters, pinching the leaves, running his thumb over the skin of the fruit to feel for the give that told him they were 3 days from harvest. He had taken over the vineyard from his own father at 23, married Eloise Dunbar at 25, had one daughter, Marlowe, and spent every day of his adult life on the high field. He knew that piece of land the way a woman knows her own kitchen. The damp spot near the northwest corner that needed extra drainage tile. The 3 rows at the southern edge that always ripened a week early. The windbreak of white pine his grandfather had planted in 1918 that still shielded the lower block from late-season frost. He was known in the valley for 2 things: the quality of his grapes and his absolute, unshakable, nearly theological belief that God had designed Briar Hollow Valley for the express purpose of growing Regent grapes. Anything else was a waste of time and an insult to the Creator's clear intent. He said it at co-op meetings. He said it at church. He said it at the kitchen table with the same flat certainty that he might say, "The sun rises in the east," and the bottom land was the one thing in his world that contradicted that belief. It was a geological anomaly, a low-lying bowl of ancient peat and clay. The creek had carved it over millennia, flooding it every 3rd spring, leaving it waterlogged the rest of the time. The soil pH hovered between 4.2 and 4.5, acidic enough to dissolve limestone, acidic enough to kill the roots of any grapevine ever planted in it. His father had tried, back in the 1950s, spent a small fortune on clay drainage tiles. The peat swallowed them within a decade. The tiles just sank into the black muck like a body into a river. Gone. Hollis himself had tried in the 1980s, trucked in 400 tons of agricultural lime to raise the pH, spread it thick, worked it in with a disc harrow, and for one season, one brief, hopeful season, the soil tested closer to 5.0, almost viable, almost possible. Then the peat ate the lime. 2 seasons. That was all it took. The acidic ground digested 400 tons of calcium carbonate like it was nothing. A chemical ghost. The pH dropped back to 4.3, and the reeds came back, and the rushes, and the skunk cabbage with its fat leaves and its smell like something dying slowly in a ditch. For Hollis, Ashford land that could not grow grapes was not land. It was failure. It was 17.4 acres of evidence that perfection was not total. And he hated it, not loudly, not dramatically. He hated it the way a man hates a scar. Quietly, permanently, with a resentment that had calcified into something indistinguishable from his bones. He hated the way the water squelched under his boots when he walked too close in July. He hated the red-winged blackbirds that nested in the cattails, birds that had no business on a working farm. He hated the way the land sat there, green and brown and wet and useless, mocking the hillside above it with its wild indifference to productivity. He told his daughter when she was a girl, standing at the kitchen window, looking down at that unruly carpet of reeds. The bottom land is where God ran out of ideas. It's the county's problem, not ours. And he meant it. He had offered to lease it to the county for $1 a year, just so they would mow the weeds. Nobody took him up on it. He paid the property taxes, $88.40 a year, out of legal obligation and nothing else. He walked the high field every morning, every single morning for 55 years. He had not set foot on the bottom land in over 20. Now let me tell you about the woman who came home. Marlo Ashford was 48 years old when she drove up the gravel access road in a rented sedan in November of 2009. The back seat was full of cardboard boxes. The trunk held a soil auger, a stack of waterproof field notebooks, and a pair of knee-high rubber boots that had more miles on them than the car. She had been gone for nearly 30 years. Left Briar Hollow at 18. Studied botany at an Ivy League university in the Northeast. Then earned a PhD in wetland ecology from a research university in the upper Midwest. Spent her 20s and 30s working for a federal wetland mitigation program. Then for a private firm that specialized in restoring degraded wetlands for environmental compliance credits. She had lived in 6 states, published papers in journals her father had never heard of, spent her career standing in mud, measuring water, cataloging plants that most people consider weeds. She was quiet, methodical. She possessed a patient observational capacity that her father, a man of action, a man who saw a problem and reached for a shovel, often mistook for indecisiveness. While he had spent his life forcing the land to yield a specific outcome, she had spent hers learning to understand what the land was already doing. She came home because her mother was dying. Eloise Ashford had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in September of 2009. By October, she was in hospice care in the front bedroom of the house, the room with the view of the high field. Hollis had moved the bed so she could see the vines, because that was his language. Grapes, the hill, the thing he had built his life around. He thought she wanted to see it one last time. Maybe she did. But Marlo noticed that her mother's eyes, in those final days, kept drifting past the vineyard, past the rows of bare vines waiting for winter, down to the bottom land, to the reeds, to the water. Eloise died on a Tuesday. The funeral was Friday. 37 people came. The minister said she had been a faithful wife and a devoted mother, which was true, but incomplete, like describing the ocean as wet. Marlo stayed. She told herself it was temporary, just until the estate paperwork was settled, just until her father adjusted. She moved into her childhood bedroom, the one at the back of the house, the one that didn't have a view of the prized high field. It had a view of the bottom land. She would lie in bed at night and look out the window and see the moonlight on the standing water between the cattails. And she would think, that's not wasteland, that's a functioning, acidic peatland wetland. It has a hydrology. It has a soil chemistry. It has a plant community that has been adapting to those conditions for thousands of years. It's not broken. It's just not what anyone here wanted it to be. But she didn't say any of this to her father. Not yet. Instead, she helped with the bookkeeping for the vineyard, sat at the kitchen table with receipts and a calculator while Hollis stood at the counter eating toast. She balanced the accounts, paid the invoices, said very little about the grapes, and every afternoon, when Hollis was on the high field checking the winter covers, she walked down to the bottom land. She wore the rubber boots. She carried the soil auger and a notebook. She sank probes into the peat. She measured the water table depth. In some places, it was only 18 inches below the surface. She sampled the soil chemistry. pH 4.2 in the northeast corner, 4.5 near the creek. She cataloged the existing flora: sphagnum moss, leatherleaf, sedge, cattail. She noted the light exposure, the frost patterns, the way cold air pooled in the lowest depressions on clear November mornings. She spent hours just watching the way the water moved, the way it sat, the way the frost crystals formed on the surface of the peat in patterns that looked random but weren't. Hollis watched her from the kitchen window, the same window his wife had looked through for 40 years. He saw his daughter walking the land he hated, stooping, writing, measuring, and he saw it as folly, harmless, but pointless. A scientist playing in the mud because she didn't know what else to do with her grief. He said it to her one evening over dinner. "There's nothing down there but mud and mosquitoes, Marlowe. The real work is up here." She just nodded and took another bite of her potatoes and didn't say a word about what she had found in her mother's jewelry box 3 days earlier. Let me tell you about the jewelry box, because this is where the story splits open. It was a wooden box, cherry, handmade. Hollis had given it to Eloise as a wedding gift in 1966. It sat on her dresser for 43 years. Marlowe had seen it her entire childhood. It held a pearl necklace, a pair of garnet earrings, a brooch shaped like a grape cluster, the ordinary treasures of a farmer's wife. But after the funeral, when Marlowe was cleaning out her mother's things, sorting what to keep and what to give to the church, she opened the box and found something underneath the velvet lining. 2 things. The first was a small pouch, tightly stitched, made of deerskin so old it had turned nearly black. Marlowe opened it carefully. Inside were a few dozen tiny dried berries, dark red, almost brown. Cranberries. She knew immediately what they were, not because she recognized the species, though she did, but because of a story A story her mother had told her when she was a girl, in a quiet voice, when Hollis was out on the high field and couldn't hear. The story of Marin Dunbar. Marin was Marlowe's great-grandmother. She had not come from Briar Hollow. She was from the sandy shores of Cape Cod. She arrived in the valley in 1890 as the young bride of the first Ashford son to carry the vineyard into a new century. She was a woman who understood tides and salt marshes and the sharp smell of ocean wind. Not rolling hills and loamy soil and the heavy quiet of an inland valley. The family story, passed through the women, never the men, was that Marin took one look at the bottom land by the creek and said to her new husband, "That's the only piece of ground here that makes any sense." The Ashford men laughed. They were men of the hill, of the sun, of the well-drained soil. They gave Marin a small vegetable garden near the house and told her to forget the swamp. But she didn't forget. She walked the bottom land the same way Marlowe was walking it now, 120 years later. And she recognized the acidic soil, the peat, the constant wetness. It reminded her of the bogs near her childhood home before she died, sometime in the 1930s. She gave her granddaughter, Eloise's mother-in-law, a small deerskin pouch. "Keep these," she said. "One day a woman in this family might learn to see the water for the gift it is, not the curse." The pouch had moved from hand to hand, always through the women, always quietly. It ended up in Eloise's jewelry box, where it sat for 60 years. That was the first thing Marlowe found under the velvet. The second thing broke her heart. It was a notebook, small, spiral-bound. The cover was soft with age, and inside, in her mother's careful handwriting, were 30 years of observations. Eloise Ashford had been studying cranberries secretly, quietly, for 3 decades, while her husband walked the high field every morning, while the world saw her as a farmer's wife who kept the books and cooked the meals and said very little. She had been conducting her own private experiment. She had planted cranberry cuttings in small pots behind the greenhouse. The greenhouse was on the far side of the equipment shed, out of the line of sight from the house, out of Hollis's daily route. She had tested different soil mixes, different water schedules. She had noted which varieties tolerated the local winter, which ones produced the darkest fruit. She had pressed samples between the pages of the notebook, tiny leaves, dried berries, a small blossom. She had done this for 30 years and never told her husband, not once. Marlowe sat on the edge of her childhood bed, holding the notebook, and she understood something that made her chest ache in a way she hadn't felt since the hospital. Her mother had known. Eloise had looked at that bottom land, at the acid soil and the standing water and the peat. And she had known, the same way Marin had known, the same way Marlowe, with all her degrees and her career and her field work, had known. 3 generations of women, each one seeing the same truth. The first one didn't have the knowledge to act on it, only the intuition. The second had more knowledge. She had taught herself, alone, in secret, behind a greenhouse. But she didn't have the voice. She didn't have the standing. She didn't have the freedom to challenge her husband's certainty about what the land was for. The third, Marlowe, had all of it. The intuition passed down through the women. The scientific training earned through decades of work. And something her mother and great-grandmother never had. Permission she gave herself. She turned to a page near the end of the notebook, dated March 2008, a year and a half before Eloise was diagnosed. It read, "The early black cuttings from pot 7 survived the winter. Root structure strong. Berry color almost black. If only someone would try this on the real ground. The real ground is ready. It has been ready for 100 years. I just can't be the one." Marlowe closed the notebook. She pressed it against her chest, and she sat there for a long time, in the dark, in the room that looked out over the bottom land, listening to the wind move through the cattails. Her mother had spent 30 years waiting for someone, and the someone was her. The next morning, Marlowe walked the bottom land with different eyes. Not just the eyes of a wetland ecologist, but the eyes of a woman carrying a century of accumulated knowledge that had been passed hand to hand in silence. She knelt in the peat near the northwest corner, where the deposit was deepest, where the pH was lowest, where the water table was closest to the surface, and she pushed her fingers into the black soil. Cold, spongy, saturated, acidic enough to dissolve the dreams of 5 generations of Ashford men, and absolutely, perfectly, ideal for growing cranberries. Because here is what Hollis never understood. What his father never understood. What no Ashford man, going back to Ezra himself, ever understood. The bottom land wasn't broken. It wasn't cursed. It wasn't where God ran out of ideas. It was a cranberry bog that had never been planted. The pH of 4.2 to 4.5 that killed grapevines. That was the exact range cranberries thrive in. The waterlogged soil that rotted every root system Hollis had ever tried to establish. Cranberries evolved in standing water. The peat that swallowed 400 tons of lime without blinking. Peat is the foundation medium for commercial cranberry production. Every characteristic that made the land useless for grapes made it perfect for cranberries. The curse was a gift. The flaw was a feature. The dead acres were alive. They had always been alive. They had been waiting. But here is the thing. Marlowe didn't just stumble onto this revelation in November of 2009 while holding her mother's notebook. That would make a simpler story, a tidier one, but not a true one. She had been preparing for this for years, back in her apartment in the upper Midwest, before her mother got sick, before the funeral, before she came home. She had already been growing cranberries from the descendants of Marin Dunbar's original wild seeds. She had received a small batch from her mother in the late 1990s. Eloise had mailed them in a padded envelope. No note, just the berries. And Marlowe, who was a wetland ecologist by then, who had spent years studying the precise conditions under which bog plants flourish, understood immediately what her mother was saying without saying it. She had cultivated them, first in pots on her apartment balcony, then in a small experimental plot at a friend's property outside the city. She had selected for hardiness, for color intensity, for the plants that produce the darkest berries with the thickest skin. She had propagated them from cuttings, year after year, building up a stock of thousands of young vines. And now, reading her mother's notebook, she realized they had been working on the same project, separately, simultaneously, for years. Eloise in her hidden pots behind the greenhouse. Marlowe in her apartment 1,200 miles away. Mother and daughter, converging on the same point from different directions, without ever talking about it. Eloise's intuition, her patient observation, her 30 years of quiet trial and error, combined with Marlowe's scientific training, her understanding of hydrology and soil chemistry, and integrated pest management and commercial bog construction. Apart, each woman had half the answer. Together, even across the distance, even across the silence, even across death, they had the whole thing. One evening, late November, the trees bare, the sky the color of a bruise. Marlowe came to the dinner table with her notebooks, both of them, her own field notebooks from the past 3 weeks, and her mother's spiral-bound journal. Hollis was at the other end of the table, going over harvest receipts, his reading glasses low on his nose, a pencil behind his ear. The high field had produced an acceptable yield that fall. Not great. The summers were getting drier, but acceptable.
I want the bottom land.
He looked up, confused, not alarmed. The way you look up when someone says something so unexpected it doesn't register as language. Want it for what? I want you to deed it to me, formally, in my name. He took off his glasses, set them on the table.
Marlowe, that land is worthless. I've told you that your whole life. I've told everyone that. You saw what it did to the lime. You saw what it did to your grandfather's drainage tiles. It eats everything you put in it.
I know what it does to lime. I know what it does to grapevines. Then what in God's name do you want with it? I'm going to grow cranberries. The word hung in the kitchen, like smoke, like a held breath, like the first crack of ice on a pond when you don't know yet if it's going to hold your weight. Hollis stared at her. Cranberries. Yes. In the swamp. It's a bog. And yes. He laughed. A short sound, dry, like a cough. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. We are a grape family. We have been for 5 generations. We make wine. We don't make sauce for a holiday dinner.
You make wine on the high field. The bottom land has never grown a single grape. It's not vineyard land. It never was. It's Ashford land. Then let an Ashford use it. He stood up. His chair scraped the floor. His face was flushed. Not red with anger exactly. More like the color a man turns when the ground shifts under him and he doesn't know which direction to step. Your mother just died. You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly. I'm not going to let you throw your savings into 17 acres of mud because you're sad and you don't know what to do with yourself. That was the moment. Right there. Marlo could have backed down. She could have said, "You're right. I'll think about it." She could have waited, been strategic, brought it up again in the spring when emotions had cooled. But she thought of her mother, standing behind the greenhouse, alone, for 30 years, studying cranberries in secret, because she didn't have the voice to say this exact sentence to this exact man. So Marlo said it again. I am going to grow cranberries on the bottom land. I need you to deed it to me. And I need you to understand that I'm not asking. Hollis looked at his daughter, and for a moment, just a flicker, something crossed his face, something that might have been recognition of Eloise, of the way Eloise used to go quiet and still when she had made up her mind. The way she would just look at him, not arguing, not pleading, just decided. He blinked, and it was gone. Fine. His voice flat. Take it. I'd pay you to haul it off the property if I could. But don't you come to me when you're broke and knee-deep in weeds asking for help. That land has beaten every Ashford who ever touched it. It'll beat you too. He left the room. He didn't slam the door. That wasn't his way. He just walked out, quiet, final, the way he did everything. The deed was transferred the following week. He signed it at the kitchen table, without looking at her, without looking at the document. He signed it the way you sign a receipt for something you've already thrown away. To him, he wasn't giving her land. He was giving her 17.4 acres of proof that she was wrong. That night, after Hollis had gone to bed, after the house was dark and the only sound was the tick of the baseboard heater and the distant murmur of Coldwater Creek through the closed windows, Marlo went into her mother's bedroom. She opened the Bible on the nightstand.
The one Eloise had read every morning for as long as Marlowe could remember. And there, pressed between the pages of Isaiah, thin as paper, brown with age, was a single cranberry blossom. Small, 4 recurved petals, the shape that gave the plant its old name, cranberry, because the blossom looks like the head and bill of a crane. Her mother had pressed it there. Marlowe didn't know when. Maybe years ago. Maybe decades. It didn't matter. What mattered was where Eloise had placed it. Not in the notebook.
Not hidden behind the greenhouse, in the Bible, the book she opened every morning, the most visible, most intimate, most sacred place in her daily life.
It was the thing Eloise looked at every day and never spoke about, and Marlowe understood. Her mother hadn't been waiting for permission. She hadn't been waiting for Hollis to change. She had been waiting for Marlowe to come home. Marlowe held the blossom in her palm, barely breathing, because it was so fragile that any movement might turn it to dust. The way truth sometimes is, so old and so thin and so light that you could destroy it by holding it wrong. She put it back, carefully, between the same pages, and she walked to her bedroom, and she looked out the window at the bottom land, silver under the November moon, the water glinting between the cattails, and she made a decision that had actually been made for her 100 years ago by a woman from Cape Cod who understood bogs, and 30 years ago by a woman who understood silence, and 10 years ago by herself in an apartment in the upper Midwest, planting cranberry cuttings in pots on a balcony, not yet knowing why, but knowing. 3 women, 1 piece of land, 100 years of patience. The bottom land had been waiting, and the women had been waiting, and now, finally, the waiting was over. The next morning, she called her old colleague from the Federal Wetland Program, a hydrological engineer she trusted. She asked him one question. If you had 17.4 acres of peat bog with a clay subsoil, a pH of 4.2, a seasonal water table at 18 inches, and an adjacent creek for water supply, could you build a commercial cranberry operation on it? There was a pause on the line. Marlowe, that's not a question. That's a blueprint. Those are ideal conditions. Where is this? Home, she said. It's been here the whole time. She hung up. She walked to the kitchen. Hollis was at the table, eating toast, reading the farm report in the county paper. He didn't look up. Marlowe poured herself a cup of coffee. She sat down across from him. She opened her mother's notebook to the first page. The first entry, dated 1979, the year Marlowe left for college. And she began to read. Not aloud, not to him, just to herself, quietly. The way her mother had written it, the way her great-grandmother had walked the land, the way the water moved through the peat, slowly, patiently, following the path of least resistance, waiting for the moment when resistance finally gave way. Outside the kitchen window, the bottom land sat in the gray November light, wet, still, ordinary. 17.4 acres of cattails and sedge and standing water and ancient peat. The same land that had humiliated Hollis's father. The same land that had swallowed Hollis's lime. The same land that had whispered to Marin and to Eloise, and now to Marlowe. It wasn't dead land. It was the most patient land in the valley, and it had just found the most patient woman in the family. Spring was 4 months away. The bulldozers would come in April, the sand trucks in May, the cranberry vines, thousands of them, raised from century-old seeds by 2 women who never stopped believing in a piece of ground that every man who owned it had abandoned. But that is part 2. And part 2 is a different kind of story. It is a story about sand and money and a man from California wine country who thought he knew what the land needed better than the woman standing in it. The trucks started coming in April. Let me tell you what that looked like. Because in Briar Hollow Valley, where the biggest piece of news in a given month might be a new tractor at the co-op or a fence dispute between neighbors, a convoy of flatbed trucks hauling a D6 bulldozer down Coldwater Creek Road was not news. It was an earthquake. The first truck came on a Monday, then another, then a lowboy carrying an excavator with a 36-inch bucket, then a water truck, then a gravel hauler. They turned off the county road and rumbled down the narrow track that led past the Ashford homestead, past the equipment shed, past the edge of the high field where the vines were just beginning to push their first green buds. And they kept going, down the slope, toward the bottom land. Hollis was on the porch, coffee in hand. He watched the parade of machinery pass his house, the way a man watches a funeral procession for someone he didn't particularly like. Distant, disapproving, but unable to look away. The neighbors watched too. The Prescotts across the valley, the Larsons up the hill, old Dale Finnick, who ran the feed store and knew everybody's business before they knew it themselves. They stood at the ends of their driveways. They leaned against fence posts. They shaded their eyes against the spring sun, and they watched a 49-year-old woman in mud-caked rubber boots direct a fleet of heavy equipment into 17 acres of swamp. And they thought she had lost her mind. Let me tell you about building a cranberry bog, because it is not like planting a field. It is not like plowing furrows and dropping seeds and waiting for rain. It is an act of engineering. It is surgery performed on the earth itself. And it is brutally, unforgivingly expensive. Marlowe had $187,000. Every dollar she had saved across 25 years of careful living. Government salary, modest apartments, No vacations that didn't involve field work. She drove a 12-year-old sedan. She owned one good pair of shoes that she wore to conferences and never anywhere else. That $187,000 represented the sum total of a life lived in deliberate preparation for a moment she hadn't fully understood was coming until she held her mother's notebook. It wasn't enough. She took a loan from a credit union 2 towns over. High interest. The kind of loan a bank gives when it doesn't really believe in the collateral. But the borrower's credit score is good enough to make saying no feel petty. The loan officer looked at her business plan, looked at the soil reports, looked at the projected timeline to first harvest. 3 years minimum. He pushed his glasses up his nose and said, "Ms. Ashford, I want to be honest with you. I don't understand what a cranberry bog is." "That's all right," she said. "Neither does anyone else around here. That's sort of the point." She signed the papers. She drove back to Briar Hollow with a check and a feeling in her stomach that was either courage or nausea. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. The work began. First, they cleared the native vegetation, the cattails, the rushes, the sedge, the stands of red osier dogwood that had colonized the edges. They cut it down and hauled it away. And for the first time in anyone's living memory, the bottom land lay exposed, raw, a flat expanse of black peat and gray clay, wet, dense, smelling of iron and rot and something older than memory. Then the excavators went to work. They scraped off the top layer of peat and set it aside in long windrows at the edge of the property. Then they dug 24 inches down, removing clay, removing roots, removing the compressed organic matter of 10,000 years, and they leveled it, all 17.4 acres, to a tolerance of less than 1 inch. Think about that. 17 acres, flat to within an inch, with equipment that was designed for road building, not surgery. Marlowe was out there every day with a laser level and a transit, checking, rechecking, making the excavator operator redo sections that were off by 2 inches. He thought she was crazy. He told his wife that evening, "Some lady PhD is making me grade a swamp like I'm building a hospital floor." But she needed it flat. Because water doesn't negotiate. Water doesn't care about your feelings or your schedule or your business plan. Water goes where gravity tells it, and if your cranberry bed has a low spot, even a small one, the water will pool there, and the vines in that spot will drown, and the vines on the high spot will dry out, and your harvest will be uneven. And uneven, in the cranberry business, is the difference between profit and bankruptcy. So, flat, to within 1 inch, across 17.4 acres. After the grading came the architecture. She divided the land into rectangular beds, 5 of them, each roughly 3 acres, separated by earthen dikes wide enough to drive a pickup truck on.
The dikes were compacted clay, 18 inches high, sloped on both sides. Each bed had a slight grade, almost imperceptible, a 1/4 inch per 100 feet, so that water would flow the direction she told it to flow. Then came the reservoir, at the lowest point of the property, where the land dipped closest to the creek. They dug a holding pond, 4 acres, 8 feet deep, lined with compacted clay to prevent seepage. This was the heart of the system, the battery, the bank account. It would capture winter rains, snowmelt, creek overflow, all the water that her father had spent his life trying to get rid of. She was collecting it, hoarding it, building a vault for it. She installed 2 60-horsepower electric pumps, one to push water from the reservoir into the bogs, one to pull it back, a closed loop, the same water, used and reused, flooding the beds when she needed to protect the plants, draining them when she needed the roots to breathe, flooding again for harvest. After the earthwork and the plumbing, they brought the peat back, the same peat they had scraped off and set aside. They spread it in a uniform 6-inch layer over the graded clay subsoil. A blanket, an organic mattress, the medium in which the cranberry roots would grow. And then the sand. Let me tell you about the sand, because the sand is the part that made everyone in Briar Hollow certain that Marlowe Ashford had gone completely, irretrievably, clinically insane. Truck after truck, starting in late May, coming every day for 3 solid weeks. 22-ton loads of coarse construction-grade sand. 650 truckloads. They came down Coldwater Creek Road in a procession so long and so steady that Dale Finnick at the feed store started keeping a tally on a chalkboard by the register. Day 1, 14 trucks. Day 2, 18 trucks. Day 3, 22 trucks. They spread a 4-inch layer of sand over the entire surface of the peat. 17.4 acres covered in sand. It looked like someone had built a beach in the middle of a valley famous for its vineyards. The cost of the sand alone was $78,000. Hollis watched from the porch. He had moved his chair so it faced the bottomland, not because he wanted to see what his daughter was doing, but because he couldn't help it. The way you can't help watching a car accident. The way you can't stop pressing a bruise. All that money, he said to Dale Finnick when Dale came by with a bag of feed supplements. To bury perfectly good peat under worthless sand. Dale nodded. Because what do you say? When a man's daughter is spending her life savings on something you don't understand. You nod. You change the subject. You talk about the weather. The other farmers had stronger opinions. They stopped their trucks on the road and stared. Men who had spent their lives coaxing things from soil, who understood the rhythms of planting and harvesting, who could look at a hillside and estimate its yield within 5%. They looked at Marlowe's flat, sand-covered,
waterless expanse, and they saw a grave, not for a person, for an inheritance, for a woman's savings and a woman's pride, and whatever was left of the Ashford family's reputation in the valley. They weren't cruel about it, not most of them. They were just sad. The way you're sad when someone you know is making a mistake and you can see it and they can't. They said things like, "Bless her heart," and "She's been away too long," and "When it doesn't work out, we'll help her clean up." And that was the world Marlowe was building in, surrounded by pity that felt like a wall. This is when Thatcher Pemberton arrived. Let me tell you about Pemberton, because he is not a villain. Not exactly. He is something more complicated and more common than a villain. He is a man who is very good at one thing, and who has mistaken being good at one thing for understanding everything. Pemberton was 38 years old, held a master's degree from a top viticulture program in California, had spent 10 years working for a major agricultural consulting firm in California wine country. He was sharp, polished, the kind of man who wore clean boots to a muddy job site because he believed first impressions were data points. He had been hired by the Briar Hollow Wine Growers Association to help them modernize, increase yields, push the valley's reputation beyond that of a reliable but unexciting regional producer. He came armed with satellite soil maps, bricks analysis charts, canopy management protocols. He spoke of deficit irrigation and phenolic ripeness with the easy authority of a man who has never had his fundamental assumptions challenged. But here is the thing about Pemberton that nobody in Briar Hollow knew, and that he never talked about. He had left California wine country under a cloud. Not a scandal exactly. Something quieter, more corrosive. He had been the lead consultant on a prestigious vineyard expansion in a valley north of San Francisco. A wealthy investor, new to wine, had purchased 200 acres and hired Pemberton to design the entire operation from scratch. Pemberton had warned the investor about phylloxera risk, had recommended resistant rootstock, had put it in writing. The investor, wanting to save money, had ignored the recommendation and planted a cheaper varietal. 3 years later, the phylloxera came. The entire vineyard was destroyed. The investor went bankrupt. And the investor, being the kind of man who becomes wealthy by always having someone else to blame, told everyone that Pemberton's plan was flawed from the beginning. It wasn't true. Pemberton had the documentation to prove it. But in consulting, truth is less powerful than reputation, and his reputation was damaged. The big firms stopped calling. The prestigious clients went elsewhere. He ended up in Briar Hollow, not by choice, by necessity. A smaller stage, a lesser valley, a place where he could rebuild, which meant he needed Briar Hollow to be a success story. His success story. He needed every farmer in the valley to follow his methods, to validate his approach, to prove that Thatcher Pemberton knew what he was doing, that the failure in California was someone else's fault. And then he heard about Marlowe, a woman spending a fortune, to grow cranberries. In a valley famous for grapes, using methods that had nothing to do with his data, his soil maps, his satellite imagery, his entire system of understanding. She wasn't just an oddity. She was a threat. Because if she succeeded, by ignoring everything he stood for, by listening to the land instead of analyzing it, then what did that say about his way of seeing the world? What did that say about the 10 years he had spent building expertise that suddenly might not apply?
He couldn't let that happen, not consciously. He didn't think of it in those terms. He thought he was helping. He genuinely believed he was doing her a favor. That's the thing about Pemberton. He wasn't malicious. He was afraid. And afraid men who think they're being helpful are the most dangerous kind. He found her one afternoon in June. She was standing by the newly dug reservoir, taking water samples. Her boots were caked with mud up to the knee. Her hands were dirty. Her hair was tied back with a rubber band. She looked like a woman who hadn't thought about how she looked in months. Pemberton wore pressed khakis, a blue Oxford shirt, clean Blundstone boots. He looked like a man who thought about how he looked every morning. Ms. Ashford. He extended a hand. Thatcher Pemberton. I'm working with the Growers Association. I couldn't help but notice your project. Marlowe looked at his clean hand. She looked at her own, covered in peat. She didn't shake it. She just nodded. Marlowe. He gestured at the vast expanse of sand, the reservoir, the dikes, the pumps. I've analyzed this parcel, the soil chemistry, the water table. I understand the challenge, but I think there's a better approach. Better for what? Better for productivity. With the right inputs. French drains. About $30,000 worth. 800 tons of lime applied over 5 years to correct the pH. A tolerant rootstock. 101-14 mgt. It handles wet feet. We could have viable Chambourcine grapes here in 4 years. My projections show $9,000 an acre at maturity. He said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis. Calm, certain, backed by data. You want to grow grapes, Marlowe said. On this land. I want to make this land productive. It is productive. It produces sphagnum moss and sedge and cattails and clean water and habitat for 37 species of native invertebrates. Those are the things this soil produces, because those are the things this soil is designed to produce. He smiled, patient, the smile of a man who believes he is dealing with someone emotional. Ms. Ashford, with all due respect, land doesn't have intentions. Data has answers. And the data says this is a correctable problem of soil management, not a fundamental characteristic of the site. The data, Marlowe said. And she held up her mother's notebook, its pages swollen with humidity, stained with soil. I have data too, 30 years of it, collected by a woman who never went to your program in California, who never ran a satellite soil analysis, who stood behind a greenhouse with a pH meter and a watering can and figured out exactly what this ground wanted to grow. She opened the notebook to a page marked with a dried leaf. Soil pH 4.3, water table 16 inches. Sphagnum present in northwest quadrant. Peat depth exceeds 36 inches. Berry set on pot 7 cuttings. Dark, firm, strong root development. She closed it. My mother wrote that in 1994. She knew. She just never got to do anything about it. Pemberton's smile faded. Not because he understood, because he didn't, and not understanding made him uncomfortable. He dealt in numbers, in projections, in systems he could model and optimize. A dead woman's notebook full of handwritten observations was not a system. It was a story, and stories, in his world, were not evidence. The offer stands, he said. When this doesn't work out, call me. We can still salvage the investment. He walked away, his boots leaving clean prints in the sand. Marlo watched him go, and she felt something she had felt her entire life in one form or another. The quiet exhaustion of being a woman who knows something that a confident man has just told her isn't true. But Pemberton didn't just walk away and wait. He went to work. At the next Growers Association meeting, he presented a case study, unnamed, but everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. He showed the soil data for the bottom land. He showed his projected returns for a grape conversion, $9,000 per acre. Then he showed the industry average return for cranberry operations in non-traditional growing regions, $1,700 per acre. He let the numbers sit there on the screen. The decision to pursue a non-native crop on marginal land, without commercial growing experience, without access to established processing facilities, without a buyer network, is a significant financial risk. He said it gently, almost sadly, like a man delivering bad news to a patient. And then he did something worse. He called the credit union. He didn't tell them to revoke the loan. That would have been too obvious, too traceable. He simply expressed. As a professional agricultural consultant, his concern about the viability of the project that their loan was funding, he suggested, politely, that they might want to reevaluate the collateral value of the property. The credit union sent Marlo a letter requesting updated financial projections, requesting a third-party assessment of the bog's commercial viability, requesting documentation that she had a buyer for the eventual crop. She had none of those things. She had a half-built bog, an empty reservoir, 26,000 cranberry vines in a cold storage facility waiting to be planted, and a dead woman's notebook. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter. Hollis was in the next room, watching the evening news, the volume up too loud the way it always was. She could hear the weather forecast. Another dry summer predicted. Another tough year for the vineyards. She put the letter in a drawer, and she went back to work. The vines went in that fall, by hand. She and 2 hired workers, local men, young. Neither of them had ever seen a cranberry plant before. She showed them how. Press the root system into the sand. Firm the sand around the base. Space them 18 inches apart. 1,500 vines per acre. 26,100 vines in total. It took them 2 months. October and November. Working in cold rain, in early frost, in mud that sucked at their boots and made every step an argument with gravity. And then, the waiting. Let me tell you about the waiting, because this is the part of the story that doesn't make for a good headline. This is the part that isn't dramatic or triumphant or even interesting to watch. This is the part that is just endurance. A cranberry bog does not produce a crop in its first year, or its second. The vines need time to root, to spread, to form the dense, interlocking mat that will eventually cover the entire bed in a carpet of low woody stems and small dark leaves. It is a long-term investment in the most literal sense. You put everything in, and for years, you get nothing back. Marlowe spent the winter of 2010 managing water levels, making sure the reservoir captured enough rain and creek overflow to be useful, making sure the beds drained properly, making sure the new dikes held. They didn't. The first crisis came in February. A 3-day rain, heavy, unseasonable. The creek rose 18 inches overnight. The water pushed against the eastern dike of Bed 4. The dike that Marlowe had built herself because the excavator contractor had already left, and she couldn't afford to bring him back. She had compacted the clay by driving her pickup truck back and forth over it, which, it turns out, is not the same as compacting it with proper equipment. The dike gave way at 2 a.m. She heard it, a sound like a deep cough in the earth. She ran down in the dark, in the rain. In boots she barely had time to pull on, and she saw the water pouring through a 30-foot breach, flooding across Bed 4, tearing the newly planted vines from the sand, washing them into a tangled mass against the far dike. 3 acres, gone. 6,450 vines, pulled from the ground and drowned in muddy water. She stood in the rain at 3 a.m, alone, the flashlight beam cutting through the downpour, illuminating the damage. And she did something she had not done since her mother's funeral. She cried. Not for long, maybe 5 minutes, standing in knee-deep water in the dark, the rain hammering the hood of her jacket. Then she stopped. She wiped her face, which was pointless because the rain was already doing that, and she started thinking about what she needed. Fill material, a rental compactor, new vines. She didn't have the money. The repair would cost at least $22,000, money she did not have. She called the credit union the next morning. They said no. They were not going to extend additional funds for a project that was already showing signs of failure. That was the word the loan officer used. Signs of failure. A dike breach in the first winter. He said it with the careful sympathy of a man who has already written you off. Marlo sold her car. The 12-year-old sedan. She got $4,000 for it. She borrowed her father's truck when she needed to drive to town. He didn't ask why she had sold her car. He didn't want to know. She picked up part-time consulting work, remote, for her old firm, reviewing wetland delineation reports at night after spending 12 hours on the bog during the day. She rebuilt the dike, properly this time. She replanted bed 4. And then the second crisis. Summer of 2011. The cranberry fruitworm came. A small moth, unremarkable. Its larvae bore into the developing fruit and eat it from the inside. In commercial cranberry regions, where the pest is well understood, there are protocols, timing windows, approved pesticides. But Briar Hollow was not a commercial cranberry region. Nobody within 200 miles had ever dealt with cranberry fruitworm. There was no local expertise, no extension agent who could help, and Marlo would not use broad-spectrum pesticides. She refused, because her mother's notebook had a whole section on pest management. Eloise had observed. In her small pots behind the greenhouse, that flooding the plants at specific intervals disrupted the moth's reproductive cycle. Drown the larvae before they pupate. Time it to the degree-day accumulation model. Eloise had worked out the timing over years of observation. It was written in the notebook in pencil. Faded, but legible. Marlo tried it. She flooded bed 2. Held the water for 48 hours, drained it, waited, flooded again. It was, she knew, either brilliant or catastrophic, because if the timing was wrong, she wouldn't just lose the pests, she'd suffocate the vines. Pemberton heard about the infestation. He mentioned it at a Growers Association meeting, casually, the way you mention the weather. I understand Ms. Ashford is dealing with a pest issue, cranberry fruitworm. Apparently she's treating it by flooding the beds. He paused. Let the image settle. Which is a bit like putting out a fire by demolishing the house. 3 people laughed. Pemberton didn't. He just moved on to the next slide. That night, Marlo sat on the main dike. It was past midnight. The air smelled of wet sand and peat. The pumps were running. A low electric hum. She could hear frogs. The first frogs she had heard on the bottom land since the construction began. That was a good sign. The ecosystem was rebuilding. But she couldn't think about frogs right now. She opened her mother's notebook by flashlight, turned to the pest management pages, read Eloise's careful handwriting. Second flood at 450-degree days. Drain at 500. Third flood only if adult moth activity observed after June 20th. And underneath that, in different ink, written maybe years later, a single sentence. I wish I could show this to someone who would believe me. Marlo closed the notebook. She pressed it against her chest, and she sat there, on the dike, in the dark, talking to her mother the way you talk to someone who can't hear you, but you need to say it anyway. I believe you, Mama.
I'm doing it. I'm here.
The flooding worked. The fruitworm population collapsed. The vines survived. Eloise's method, developed over 30 years of secret observation, applied by her daughter on the exact piece of land she had studied from behind a greenhouse window, was correct. But the victory was invisible. Nobody saw it. Nobody knew that a dead woman's notebook had just saved a cranberry crop. All they saw, from the outside, was a woman standing in a flooded field, doing something that made no sense. The third year, 2013, was the year everything was supposed to come together. The vines had survived 2 winters. They had spread, rooted. The beds were green, not lush, not yet, but green. Small white blossoms appeared in June. Bees worked them. Marlowe had introduced native pollinators the previous spring. Mason bees, bumblebees. She had built nesting boxes along the dike edges. In September, the first cranberries appeared, small, pale at first, then slowly, over weeks, turning pink, then red, then a deep, dark, almost maroon. The harvest was October, and it was, by any objective measure, a disaster. The vines were too young, too sparse. Each one produced only a handful of berries. Marlowe couldn't afford water harvesting equipment. The machines that flood the beds and churn the berries loose. So she and her 2 workers harvested dry, on their hands and knees, using small handheld scoops, combing through the vines 1 row at a time. It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks for 17 acres, and the total yield was 8,000 pounds. She sold it to a small jam maker in the next county. A woman named Ruth, who made preserves in her farmhouse kitchen and sold them at craft fairs. Ruth paid $1.50 per pound because she liked Marlowe and because the berries, though few, were extraordinary, dark, tart, with a depth of flavor Ruth said she had never tasted in a commercial cranberry. Marlowe's gross revenue for the year, her first year of any income at all from the bog, was $12,000. Her operating expenses, not including her own labor, which she never counted, were over $40,000. She was losing money. She had been losing money for 3 years. She had sold her car. She had taken on consulting work she didn't have time for. She had repaired a dike breach out of pocket. She had fought a pest infestation with a method written in pencil by a dead woman. And now, standing in her kitchen, looking at the numbers on a piece of scrap paper, she was staring at a $12,000 harvest against a $40,000 year. The letter from the credit union came 2 days later. They wanted a payment adjustment, higher monthly minimum, given the, as they put it, lower than projected initial returns. And then, the meeting Pemberton presented at the October Growers Association gathering. He had slides. He had a projector. He had the calm, measured delivery of a man who believes he is being fair. I want to give an update on regional diversification efforts, he said, and then he showed the numbers, Marlowe's numbers, which were technically public record since her harvest had been sold through a registered agricultural transaction. 460 pounds per acre. He let that number sit on the screen. For context, he said, the Prescott Vineyard, following our recommended protocol, yielded 4.5 tons per acre in its first partial production year. That's a dollar per acre comparison of approximately $700. He clicked the slide. Versus 12,825. He didn't name Marlowe. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew. Cranberry cultivation in a non-traditional region, without processing infrastructure, without buyer networks, without proven pest management protocols, represents, in my professional assessment, a hobby, not a commercial agricultural enterprise. He said it gently, regretfully, the way you tell a friend that their painting is not very good. And that might have been the end of it. That might have been the moment Marlowe became a permanent cautionary tale in Briar Hollow. Something people mentioned at the co-op with a shake of their head. Remember the Ashford woman and her cranberry bog. What a shame. Except Willa Prescott stood up. Willa was 82 years old. She was the widow of Harlan Prescott, who had farmed the east side of the valley for 40 years. She was 4 feet 11 inches tall. She weighed maybe 105 pounds. She wore a blue cardigan that she had owned since the 1990s, and she had been sitting in the back row, saying nothing, the way she usually did at these meetings, the way women of her generation often did, letting the men talk, letting the men show their slides and their data and their confidence. She stood up, slowly, the way you stand when your knees hurt and you're not doing it for comfort. I have something to say. The room went quiet. Willa Prescott did not speak at meetings. Willa Prescott brought cookies to meetings. Willa Prescott sat in the back and smiled and let her son handle the family's vote. Willa Prescott speaking was like a piece of furniture suddenly having an opinion. I was a girl when Marin Ashford walked that bottom land. I remember her. She wore a gray coat and she had a walking stick, and she would go down there in the morning and just stand, looking at the water. My mother said she was peculiar. My father said she was harmless. She paused, looked around the room. Her eyes were very clear. She wasn't peculiar, and she wasn't harmless. She was right. She knew what that land was, and nobody listened to her. Because she was a woman, and she was from somewhere else, and she was married to a man who thought he knew better. She looked directly at Pemberton. That was 1920. This is 2013, and I am watching the same thing happen again. A woman who knows what that land is, and a room full of people who won't listen, because the numbers on a screen are easier to believe than a woman standing in mud. She turned to the room. Give her time. Give that girl time.
I have a feeling about this. The same feeling Marin had.
She sat back down. The meeting continued. Pemberton recovered quickly. He moved to the next topic. Marketing initiatives for the coming year. But something had shifted. Not much, not dramatically. You wouldn't have noticed if you weren't paying attention. But 3 people in that room, 3 women, in the back rows, caught Marlowe's eye as she was leaving, and they nodded. That was all. A nod. Not a promise of help, not a check, not a volunteer crew. Just, we see you, we hear you, keep going. And Marlowe kept going. The next 3 years were a slow, grinding, incremental climb. The yield grew. 15,000 pounds in 2014, 28,000 in 2015, 45,000 in 2016. She was still losing money, but the gap was closing. And the berries were changing. She had noticed it first in 2014, the northwest corner of Bed 1, where the peat was deepest, where the pH dipped to 4.1, where the water table was closest to the surface. The berries from that section were different, darker, almost black. Smaller than the fruit from the other beds, but denser, heavier, with a flavor that was more intense, more complex, like the difference between a table wine and something aged in a cellar for 20 years. She began segregating that harvest, setting it aside. She sent samples to a university lab for analysis. The reports came back showing polyphenol and proanthocyanidin levels that made the lab technician call her to confirm the sample hadn't been contaminated. It hadn't. The berries from the northwest corner were producing antioxidant compounds at concentrations far above the commercial average. Levels that the health food industry and the emerging nutraceutical market were just beginning to understand the value of. Marlowe wasn't just growing cranberries. She was growing a specific, unique, unrepeatable expression of that particular piece of land. The same acid peat that killed grapes. The same waterlogged clay that swallowed lime. The same conditions that Hollis called a curse were producing a berry that no other piece of ground on earth could replicate. Because it was that ground, that exact chemistry, that exact hydrology, that exact depth of peat laid down over millennia by the slow, patient work of sphagnum moss and thyme. The land was speaking, and it was saying something nobody had expected. And then the drought came. Summer of 2017, the worst in 50 years. It started in May, a dry spring, unusual but not alarming. Then June passed without rain. Then July. The temperature climbed, day after day of clear sky and hot sun and air that sucked the moisture from the soil like a sponge. The high field began to suffer first. The grapevines, their roots searching the parched loam for water that wasn't there, began to drop their fruit. The leaves curled, turned yellow at the edges, then brown. Hollis walked his rows every morning, the way he had for 55 years.
But now his walk was slower. His face was different. He touched the leaves and they crackled. He looked at the sky and the sky was empty.
The Prescott Vineyard, the one Pemberton had designed with such precision, fared better. They had a drip irrigation system, computer-controlled, feeding each vine a measured dose of water through a network of plastic tubing. But the water had to come from somewhere. They were pumping from a deep well, and the well was drawing down. And the electricity to run those pumps was costing more each week. And the computer, that precise, data-driven, optimized computer, was running calculations based on a water supply that was shrinking. The creek slowed to a trickle. You could walk across it without getting your ankles wet. The valley held its breath. Farmers looked at the sky every morning, the way sailors look at the horizon, searching for something that wasn't there. And the bottom land, Marlowe's bog, was an oasis. Her reservoir, the 4-acre holding pond she had dug at the lowest point of the property, the one the community had watched her build with such bewildered pity, was full. She had spent 7 years capturing water that everyone else wanted to get rid of. Rain, snowmelt, creek overflow. Every gallon that the valley shed, she caught. And now, in the driest summer in half a century, she had water, millions of gallons of it, sitting in a clay-lined pond, waiting. She flooded the beds. Not because the cranberries needed it. Cranberries are remarkably drought-tolerant once established. But because the flooding kept the soil temperature down, protected the root systems, maintained the careful balance of moisture and oxygen that the vines had spent 7 years building. Then she pumped the water back into the reservoir and used it again. A closed loop, the same water, cycling through the system, while every vineyard in the valley was watching its wells go dry. For the first time in 7 years, people driving past on Coldwater Creek Road didn't see a folly. They didn't see a mistake. They didn't see a woman's failed investment in 17 acres of sand and mud. They saw green, a lush, deep, impossible green, in a valley that had turned the color of dust. That year, Marlowe's harvest crossed the threshold, 120,000 pounds. She found a specialty buyer in the Pacific Northwest, a company that was building a brand around high antioxidant superfoods. They had seen her lab reports. They were willing to pay $4 a pound for the berries from the northwest corner. And Hollis did something he had not done in over 20 years. He walked to the edge of the bottom land, not down to it, not onto it. He stopped at the top of the slope, where the high field ended and the bottom land began, where the green of the vineyard, which was now not green at all, but the yellow-brown of a dying crop, met the green of the bog, which was the deep,
living green of a system that had water when nothing else did. He stood there, his hands at his sides, his face unreadable. He didn't walk down the slope. He didn't step onto the dike. He just stood at the edge, looking. Marlo was on the main dike, checking a pump. She looked up and saw him, a tall figure, stooped, silhouetted against the brown hillside, standing exactly at the line where his world ended and hers began. He stood there for maybe 10 minutes. She watched him the whole time. Neither of them waved. Neither of them called out. Then he turned and walked back to the house, slowly, the way a man walks when the ground he's standing on has become uncertain. He didn't say a word about it at dinner. Not that night. Not the next day. Not ever. But Marlo knew what she had seen. She had seen her father, for the first time in his life, look at the bottom land without contempt. He wasn't ready to call it anything yet. Not success, not vindication, not even interesting. But the contempt was gone, and in its place was something quieter, more frightened. The beginning of a question he didn't yet know how to ask. The drought broke in September. The rains returned. The vineyards recovered, partially. Hollis's yield that year was the worst of his career, but the vines survived. He would farm them again the next season and the season after. But something had changed. In the valley, in the Ashford household, in the space between a father and a daughter who sat across from each other at the same kitchen table every evening and talked about everything except the one thing that mattered. Marlo's bog was not a joke anymore. It was not a cautionary tale. It was not a hobby. It was the only piece of agricultural land in Briar Hollow Valley that had come through the worst drought in 50 years without breaking a sweat. And in 2 years, when the vines reached full maturity, when the berries from the northwest corner would be at their peak potency, when the buyer from the Organic Food Consortium would fly in from the coast to look at her lab reports and write a number on a white card, everything was going to change. But Marlo didn't know that yet. She only knew what she had always known, what her mother had known, what Marin Dunbar had known 100 years before. The land tells you what it wants to be. You just have to be quiet enough, and patient enough, and stubborn enough to hear it. And then you have to be brave enough to do what it says. Even when your father is watching from the porch, even when the expert from California is shaking his head, even when the numbers don't add up yet, even when the only people who believe you are a dead woman's notebook and an 82-year-old lady in a blue cardigan. You keep going. Because the land is patient, but it is not infinite. It will not wait forever. And the women who understood it, all three of them, across 100 years, had learned the same lesson. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing a woman can do is refuse to stop. By the fall of 2019, the bog had become something else entirely. Not just a farm, not just a business, something harder to name. The vines had grown into a dense, interlocking mat that covered every bed from dike to dike, low and woody and dark green. The kind of green that doesn't ask permission, the kind that simply is, has always been, and intends to keep being long after everyone who doubted it is gone. Marlowe walked the dikes every morning now the way her father walked the high field. The same slow, deliberate circuit. The same pausing to crouch down and check the fruit. Running her thumb across the skin of a berry the way Hollis ran his thumb across a grape cluster. Feeling for the give, the density, the moment of readiness. The berries were ready. Let me tell you about a cranberry harvest, because most people have never seen one, and the ones who have never forget it. It begins before dawn. The crew arrives in the dark. 6 people. 8. Marlowe's 2 original workers, who had been with her since the beginning, since the dike breach and the fruit worm and the $3 an hour consulting work she had done at midnight to keep the loan current. They knew this land, had watched it transform from a sand-covered flat into this, and they were here. The pump started at 5 in the morning. The first bed to be harvested was bed 3, the largest, the most productive. 3.5 acres of mature vines. Water rose from the reservoir, moved through the pipes, entered the bed at the northwest corner, and began to climb. It was slow at first. Just a darkening of the sand around the vine bases, then a spreading wetness, then a shine, then, inch by inch, a rising, the water climbing up through the root mat, through the woody stems, past the leaves, until the entire bed was covered, 12 inches deep, a shallow inland lake where 6 weeks ago there had been dry land. And then the berries floated. This is the thing about cranberries. Each berry has 4 small air pockets inside, natural chambers, which is why. When you flood a mature bed, the berries detach from the vines and rise to the surface, every single one, all at once, like a secret the land has been keeping all year. The surface of the water turned red, not pink, not orange, red, deep, dark, saturated red, the color of old brick and new blood and October maples and something older than any of those things. A machine moved across the surface of the water, a floating boom. It churned the water gently, loosening any berries still clinging to the vines, and slowly, the entire bed became a carpet of red, 3.5 acres of floating cranberries moving gently in the artificial current, bumping softly against each other, a sound like very light rain.
The crew moved the floating boom in a slow circle, corralling the berries toward the east corner of the bed, where a conveyor belt lifted them from the water into a waiting truck in a waterfall of dark red fruit. Marlo stood on the dike, watching.
She had imagined this moment for 10 years. She had held it in her mind through the dike breach, through the fruit worm, through the credit union letters, through Pemberton's slideshow. Through every morning she had walked these dikes, wondering if she was wrong, if everyone else was right, if the bottom land was just the bottom land and always would be. And now she was watching it happen. The thing she had always known was possible. The thing her mother had spent 30 years preparing for in secret. The thing her great-grandmother had seen in 1890 and spoken once and never been heard. It was real. It was here. It was 3.5 acres of floating red proof. She did not cry. She did not smile. She just stood, very still. The October wind moving across the surface of the water. The berries turning slowly in the current. The sound of the conveyor belt and the water and the crew calling to each other across the beds. And then she heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. Slow, careful. The sound of a man who needs a cane on uneven ground. She turned.
Hollis Ashford stood at the end of the main dike, 40 feet away. He had walked down from the house, across the slope, down the access path, through the gate she had installed in 2012, a gate he had never once walked through. He was 78 years old, stooped, the cane in his right hand, his white hair under a wool cap, his face, that face she had known her whole life, set in the expression she could never read, the one that looked like disapproval until you noticed the eyes, and then you weren't sure what it was. He didn't speak. He walked to the edge of the dike, right to the edge where the water began, and he looked out at the red. He had not stood on this land in over 25 years. Marlo watched him. She didn't move toward him, didn't speak. She understood, without knowing exactly how she understood, that this moment required silence, that if she spoke, he would have to respond, and responding would force him to become someone he didn't yet know how to be. So she just watched. He stood at the edge of the water for a long time, his cane planted in the earth beside him, his eyes moving slowly across the surface of the red, across the floating berries, across the crew working the boom, across the conveyor and the truck and the machinery of a harvest he had spent a decade calling impossible. He watched the water being used as a tool, the same water, the same flood, the same rise that had made him hate this land for 50 years. Being used
as a gentle, efficient, almost elegant harvesting machine. He watched his daughter move along the far dike, checking the flow rate on a pump, making a note in her field book, directing a worker with a gesture that needed no words because she and her crew had built a language together over 10 years. The way families do. He watched for an hour. Marlo kept working. She let him watch. She had been waiting for this her whole life, and she could wait a little longer. Then Hollis turned, slowly, and walked back toward the house. Before the truck was full, before the harvest was done, before she could see his face, he didn't say anything, but he came back the next day, and the day after that. Now let me take you to October. The third week, the community hall at the edge of town. The annual Briar Hollow Valley Harvest Auction. This was the social and economic event of the year. The moment when the season was measured, tallied, ranked. When bragging rights were established and grudges were renewed, and the whole valley held its collective breath to find out who had won and who had lost. Farmers came in their good boots, their wives in their good coats. The hall smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and the particular tension of people who had been working toward this moment for 12 months. Thatcher Pemberton was near the front. Of course he was. He had a glass of the Prescott Pinot Noir in his hand, and he had reason to be pleased. The Prescott Vineyard, his great success, his proof of concept, his rehabilitation story, had produced an exceptional crop. The preliminary bids were already circling around $2,850 per ton, with a yield of 4.5 tons per acre. He was looking at $12,825 per acre for his flagship client. He had spent the walk across the parking lot doing the math, then redoing it, the way you redo a math problem you already know the answer to, just for the pleasure of seeing it confirmed. $12,825 per acre. That was the number. That was the validation. That was the thing that would follow his name when people talked about Briar Hollow. Pemberton's method, Pemberton's system, Pemberton's results. He found a farmer he knew and began talking about canopy management and clone selection and the virtues of deficit irrigation. He was confident, comfortable, in his element. Marlo was in the back, standing against the wall by the emergency exit. She was wearing clean jeans and a flannel shirt she had owned for 12 years. She was not officially part of the auction. She had already made her sale, weeks before, when a buyer from a national organic food consortium had called her agent after 2 years of tracking her lab reports, after 2 years of watching her proanthocyanidin numbers climb in ways that didn't seem commercially possible. They had not asked to taste the berries. They had looked at a lab report, and they had offered a preemptive bid for her entire harvest. All of it, before it left the bog. Her agent had negotiated the terms, $1.20 per pound for the complete lot. £344,250. The entire yield of 17.4 acres of bottom land that one man had offered to the county for $1 a year. The auctioneer had agreed to announce it as a courtesy and as, he admitted when he called her agent, a bit of local drama. Marlowe stood against the wall and watched the room. She watched Pemberton hold court. She watched the Prescott family beam with the particular pride of people who have been publicly successful. She watched the other farmers with their programs and their cups of coffee. Men who had watched her build a bog and shaken their heads. Men who had heard Pemberton's slideshow presentation. Men who had nodded at the word hobby. She was not angry. She needed to say that clearly. She was not standing there in the back collecting her vindication, counting down to the moment she could fold her arms and say, "I told you so." She was something else, something quieter and harder to name. She was thinking about her mother, standing behind the greenhouse, alone, for 30 years. She was thinking about Marin Dunbar, walking the bottom land in a gray coat, speaking once, not being heard. She was thinking about Willa Prescott, standing up in a room full of men, blue cardigan, arthritic knees, 4 feet 11 inches of a woman who had seen this coming from 82 years away. And she was thinking about herself at 3 a.m, on the dike, crying in the rain, reading her mother's handwriting by flashlight, promising a woman who couldn't hear her that she was doing it, that she was here. The auctioneer cleared his throat. He was a man named Gerald who had been running this auction for 22 years. He was not given to drama. He moved through the lots quickly, professionally, each lot, each price, each handshake. Then he reached the end of his usual program. He shuffled his papers. He looked at a small white card in his left hand. He looked up at the room.
Now, we have something a little different tonight. A private preemptive bid that's been submitted for the complete cranberry harvest from Ashford Bog. A murmur moved through the room. Cranberry was not a word that belonged at this auction. Cranberry was not a word that belonged in this valley. Cranberry was the thing the Ashford woman had been doing with that swamp for 10 years, while the real farming happened on the hillsides. The bid is $1.20 per pound. Gerald read from the card. For the entire lot of 344,250 pounds. He paused, the way auctioneers pause when they know a number is going to need a moment to land. That comes to a total sale price of $413,100. The room went dead. Not the regular quiet of an auction pause. A different kind of silence. The kind that happens when the air pressure changes. When something is said that rearranges the architecture of the room in real time. $413,000 for cranberries from the swamp, from the bottom land, from the 17 acres that John Ashford and his father before him and his father's father had treated as a liability, as a geological embarrassment. as the place where God ran out of ideas. Pemberton stopped talking, mid-sentence, about something related to bricks levels. He stopped, and he looked at Gerald, and he picked up the program from the table beside him. He turned it over to the blank side. He found a pen in his jacket pocket. He divided 413,100 by 17.4. He stared at the number. $23,741.38 per acre. He did it again, because the number couldn't be right. He wrote it out, slowly. $23,741 per acre. Then he did the comparison. $12,825 per acre for the Prescott Vineyard. His finest work, his validation project, his career rehabilitation in a single number, against $23,741. He did the division one more time, the ratio. Almost 2-to-1. Not slightly better. Not meaningfully better. Almost 2-to-1. The bog. The swamp. The economic tragedy. The cautionary tale had just generated almost double the revenue per acre of the most celebrated, most technically advanced, most meticulously managed vineyard in the valley. And it had done it in drought conditions, with no synthetic inputs, with no GPS-guided equipment, with no computer-controlled irrigation, with a pest management system written in pencil in a dead woman's notebook, with seeds from a deerskin pouch that had sat in a jewelry box for 60 years. Pemberton put the pen down. He looked at his wine glass. He set it on the table. He didn't pick it up again. The room was still quiet. That deep, structural quiet. The kind that comes after something changes. After a before becomes an after, and you can feel the line between them. Gerald looked around the room, waiting for questions. There were none. He cleared his throat. Lot is confirmed. Sale to the consortium buyer at the stated price. Congratulations to Ashford Bog. 200 people in that hall turned, slowly, almost in unison, to look at the woman by the back wall. Marlo Ashford in her 12-year-old flannel shirt, standing against the emergency exit, her hands at her sides, her face calm, very still. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't crying. She wasn't raising her glass or accepting congratulations or doing any of the things a person does when they win. She was just present, the way she had always been present on the bog. Steady, observational, quiet. And then Willa Prescott moved. The old woman rose from her chair in the third row, slowly, the way she did everything, with the careful deliberation of a person who has decided that every movement is going to cost something and is determined to spend it well. She walked to the back of the room, down the side aisle, past the farmers and their wives, past the tables with the coffee urns, past Pemberton, who didn't look up. She stopped in front of Marlo. She took Marlo's hand in both of hers. Small hands, warm. The hands of a woman who had been putting up preserves and managing a farm and raising children and attending meetings like this one for 60 years. The hands of a woman who knew what it cost to keep going. She looked up at Marlowe, her eyes very clear. "Mama knew," she said. 2 words. That was all. But Marlowe understood every word inside those 2 words. Every generation of women who had known and not been heard. Every observation that had been dismissed. Every notebook kept in secret. Every blossom pressed into a Bible page that nobody was supposed to see. Every woman who had stood on that land and told the truth and been answered with laughter or silence, or the patient condescension of men who believed that data was more reliable than knowing. Mama knew, and her mother knew, and Marin knew, and Marlowe had always known. And it was true, all of it, all along. Marlowe pressed her lips together. She breathed once, through her nose, and then the tears came. The first ones she had cried in public since her mother's funeral. Maybe the first ones she had allowed herself since that night on the dike, in the rain when she had cried for 5 minutes and then stopped and thought about film material and rental equipment. She was not a woman who cried easily. She was a woman who converted emotion into action, who took grief and made it into greenhouse experiments and field notebooks and 650 truckloads of sand, who took loss and made it into something that floated on water and turned the surface red. But this was different. This was not grief. This was arrival. This was the moment when everything that had been held tightly for 10 years, for 30 years, for 100 years, was allowed to be exactly what it was. She held Willa's hands, and she did not apologize for the tears, and Willa did not look away. 2 women, 50 years apart, standing in the back of a room full of farmers, holding the weight of what had finally been said out loud. Let me tell you about the aftermath, because the money changed things, but not in the ways people expected. Marlowe paid off the credit union loan first. The day after the auction, she drove to the branch 2 towns over. The same branch where the loan officer had looked at her business plan and said he didn't understand what a cranberry bog was. He wasn't working there anymore. A younger woman processed the payoff. She looked at the amount, looked at Marlowe, and said, "You're the cranberry woman." She said it the way you say something you've heard about and finally believe. "I'm one of them," Marlowe said. She drove home. She sat in her father's truck in the driveway for a moment, looking at the house. The same house she had grown up in. The same wraparound porch. The same kitchen window where Hollis had watched her walk the bottom land with a soil auger and a notebook. Where Eloise had stood before him.
looking not at the high field, but at the water.
She went inside, made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table. Hollis was in his chair in the living room, the evening news playing at a volume that could be heard 2 counties over. She didn't tell him about the loan payoff. He would find out eventually. He always found out eventually in a house this size. But she didn't announce it, because it was not a victory over him. It was never a victory over him. She bought the 30 acres downstream, a parcel of marshy bottomland that ran along Coldwater Creek for a 1/4 mile below her property. It had been on the market for years. Nobody wanted it. Too wet, too low, too far from the road to be developed easily. The asking price was $60,000. She paid it in full. Then she put the entire 30 acres into a conservation easement with a regional land trust, protecting the watershed, ensuring that the water flowing into her bog would never be contaminated by upstream development, ensuring that the creek that had flooded the bottomland every 3rd spring for as long as anyone could remember would keep doing exactly that. She wasn't just protecting her investment. She was protecting the system, the hydrology, the relationship between the land and the water that had been building for 10,000 years before any Ashford ever set foot in the valley. She gave her 2 original workers a significant bonus, enough to cover a year's mortgage for each of them. Then she put them on full salaries with benefits, because they had stayed through the dike breach and the fruit worm and the years of no profit. They had shown up every morning in whatever weather and done the work. And that kind of loyalty is not something you can pay back, but you can try. She bought a new sorting machine, more efficient, more precise. It could separate the northwest corner berries from the rest of the harvest automatically, based on density and color, which meant she could produce 2 distinct products: the standard harvest for the consortium and the high-potency dark berries from the northwest corner, which were worth, as the nutraceutical market was beginning to understand, more than twice the price per pound. She did not buy a new car. She continued to drive her father's truck. She continued to live in her childhood bedroom, the one with the view of the bottomland, the one she had slept in since she was a girl, the one she had come back to in November of 2009 with a soil auger and 2 rubber boots and a grief so large she could barely see past it. She was home. She had always been home. She just needed 10 years to make the ground beneath her feet mean what she had always known it could mean. Thatcher Pemberton left Briar Hollow at the end of that year. He was offered a position with a large agricultural corporation based in the Midwest. A real position, a significant salary. The kind of work that required his specific expertise, optimizing large-scale grain and soy operations, systems that were already known, already proven, problems that could be solved with the tools he had.
He took it, and to his credit, he took it without bitterness. He packed his things. He drove out of the valley on a gray December morning, and on his way past the Ashford property, he slowed. He looked at the bog, the beds covered for winter, the reservoir reflecting the cold sky, the dikes, the pumps, the whole intricate, self-sustaining system that had humiliated his world view with a number at an auction. He did not stop. He did not get out. But he slowed. And he looked.
And he thought something he had never thought before. Not as a professional, not as a consultant, not as a man with a master's degree and a decade of expertise, but as a person, he thought. I was looking at the right land with the wrong eyes. He didn't say it to anyone. He didn't write it down. But he thought it, and that small thought, held quietly in a car driving out of a valley he had spent 2 years trying to improve, was the beginning of a different kind of understanding. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had learned to see the world in one way, and whose way of seeing had been built so deep into him that he could not see around it. He could optimize what he understood. He was genuinely excellent at that, but he could not imagine what he didn't already know. And that limitation, quiet and invisible and unexamined, had cost him. Not as much as it had cost the women who had been ignored before they ever met him, but it had cost him something. That is the truth about Pemberton. It is not a comfortable truth, but it is the kind of truth that has a chance of making a person different on the other side of it. Now, let me tell you about Hollis, because this is the part of the story that matters most, and the part that is hardest to tell without getting it wrong. In the year after the auction,
He developed a new habit. Every evening after dinner, he put on his coat, he picked up his cane, and he walked down the slope to the bottom land, slowly, all the way down, through the gate, out onto the main dike, and he sat.
Marlowe had installed a bench on the dike in the spring of 2019. Rough-hewn cedar, wide enough for 2 people. She had not put it there for him. She had put it there for herself. For the mornings when she needed to sit and think. When the weight of running the operation was heavy, and she needed to just be on the land for a moment without doing anything to it. But Hollis found the bench, and every evening he sat on it, alone, in the cooling air, and watched the bog. He watched the way the light changed across the surface of the water in the reservoir, the way the resident ducks had taken over the far corner, the way the red-winged blackbirds that had always nested in the cattails now nested in the hedgerow she had planted along the south dike. The same red-winged blackbirds he had spent 50 years calling pests, birds that had no business on a working farm.
They had business here. They had always had business here. He understood that now. A little, in the way that a man understands things when it is almost too late to do anything with the understanding except hold it. Marlowe joined him some evenings. Not all of them. She understood that he needed some of that time alone. But some evenings she would come down after clearing the dinner dishes, and she would sit beside him on the cedar bench, and they would look at the bog together. They didn't talk much. They were both people who communicated more in silence than in words. It was, Marlowe thought, one of the things they had in common that neither of them had ever named. One evening in the fall of 2020, the air already cold, the reservoir reflecting a sky the color of pewter, Hollis said something she had been waiting a long time to hear. Not the specific words. She couldn't have predicted the specific words, but the fact of them. The existence of a moment when he would say something true about what had happened between them. "Could you read to me?" She looked at him. "From your mother's notebook," he said. "I'd like to hear what she wrote." Marlowe went inside. She got the notebook from her dresser. She came back to the bench. She sat beside him. She opened it to the first page. 1979, the year she left for college. The year Eloise had begun recording what she saw. And she read. She read about the soil samples Eloise had taken with a kitchen spoon. About the pH strips she had ordered from a seed catalog. About the cuttings she had rooted in mason jars on the windowsill of the greenhouse. About the first berries that appeared in the fall of 1981. Small, dark, almost black. The way Eloise had held one in her palm and thought about Marin. About the woman who had brought the seeds from the sea. She read for an hour, while the light faded, while the cold came in off the water, while Hollis sat beside her with his hands on his cane and his eyes on the bog. When she stopped, the page had run out of light. She couldn't read anymore without a lamp. Hollis didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "Your great-grandmother would be proud." He said it quietly, his voice rough from age and cold. "She always did like the water." And then, after another silence, "Your mother, too." That was it. Those sentences, that small, late, imperfect acknowledgement, was the closest he ever came to an apology, to an admission that the thing he had spent his life dismissing had been worth more than everything he had spent his life building. That the 17.4 acres he had called a curse were a gift, and that the women who had known it, all three of them, across a century, had been right all along. Marlowe closed the notebook. She looked at her father, at his profile against the dark water, old, tired, diminished in the ways that age diminishes everyone. And she felt something that she had not expected to feel, something that had no bitterness in it at all. She felt grateful that he had come to the bench, that he had asked for the notebook, that in his final years he had found his way, slowly and partially and imperfectly, to this piece of ground he had avoided for 25 years and had let himself be changed by it. It wasn't everything. It wasn't enough. In some ways, it was too late. But it was real. And real is more than many people get.
Hollis Ashford died in the spring of 2021. He was 80 years old. He passed quietly in his sleep on a Tuesday night in April. The same month the construction crews had first arrived in 2010. The same month the bulldozers had come down Coldwater Creek Road while he watched from the porch with his coffee and his disapproval. He was buried in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church at the top of the valley. The same cemetery where every Ashford going back to Ezra was buried. The same hill that had been farmed by his grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather. Marlowe found something on his nightstand when she went in to collect his things. A Bible. The same Bible that had been there her whole life. She opened it. She knew what she was looking for. She turned the pages slowly. It was in Isaiah, the same passage where she had found it, the same pressed blossom she had left there, thin and brown and barely there, a cranberry flower, 4 recurved petals, the shape of a crane's head. But it had been moved. The page she found it on was not the same page she had last seen it. He had moved it. He had opened the Bible after she had shown him, maybe many times, and he had touched it, and he had carried something. She stood in his room for a long time, holding the open Bible. She thought about a man who spent his whole life knowing exactly what the land was for, who had never once questioned whether his certainty might be the thing standing between him and the truth, who had looked at the same 17 acres for 50 years and seen only failure, and who, in his last years, had walked down to those same acres every evening and watched the water and the birds and the daughter he had underestimated and the legacy he had nearly missed entirely. She thought about how much courage it takes to be wrong, how quietly enormous it is. When a man who has built his entire identity around being right, around knowing, around the authority of a father and a farmer and the 5th generation of a name, slowly, silently, without announcement, decides to sit beside what he rejected and let it teach him. It isn't a grand gesture. It doesn't make for a speech. You don't get to admire it from across a room. You only see it if you're sitting right next to it on a bench in the failing light. She put the Bible on the dresser. She walked out. She went down to the bog. She walked the dikes the way she did every morning. She checked the pumps. She noted the water level in the reservoir. She made a mark in her field notebook, and she let herself be grateful, not only for the land, or for the harvest, or for the number that had been read aloud in a hall full of people who finally had to see her, but for the fact that her father had found the bench and had sat on it and had asked to hear her mother's words.
That was the inheritance she hadn't expected. The one that didn't have a dollar value. The one that lived in the space between a father and a daughter, sitting in the dark. On a piece of ground he once called worthless. Listening to the voice of a woman they had both loved and in different ways had both been shaped by. Now let me tell you about Hadley. He was 21, studying business at a state university. He had spent his whole life watching the Highfield from the kitchen window, the way all Ashford children did. He had understood from his earliest years that the vineyard was the family's real work, the legacy, the thing that mattered. The bog was Aunt Marlowe's project, a thing he respected without quite understanding. The way you respect something you've never seen fail without knowing what it cost to build. After the auction, he started asking questions. He called Marlowe from his apartment near campus. It was a Sunday, November, cold. "How did you know?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Know what?" "That you were right, when everyone was saying you were wrong." "How did you know you weren't just? How did you know you weren't just stubborn?" She thought about that. She thought about her mother's notebook, about Marin's seeds, about 3 a.m. on the dike in the rain, about the exact moment when she had not known, when she had thought, maybe they're right, maybe I'm wrong, maybe this is just what grief looks like when it has nowhere to go. "I didn't always know," she said. "Sometimes I was just still going because stopping felt worse than being wrong." He came home that summer, not for the grape harvest. He came to work for Marlowe. He showed up in May with a pair of used rubber boots he had bought at the farm supply store in town, and a willingness to do whatever she told him. She started him on irrigation, checking the pipes, testing the valves, learning the system. He spent a week just following her around the dikes with a notebook, writing down what she said, what she observed, why she made the decisions she made. He was not a fast learner. He was a careful one, which is different and better. By the end of the summer, he could walk the beds and identify a drainage problem before it became a crisis. He could read the color of the vine leaves and know whether the plants needed more water or less. He understood the hydrology, not as data, not as numbers on a screen, but as a living thing that he was in a relationship with. He was not inheriting land. He was inheriting a way of seeing, a method of attention, a practice of patience that had been passed, unevenly, imperfectly, through women for 100 years, and was now, finally, being passed openly, in the daylight, on a piece of ground that belonged entirely to itself. One afternoon in late August, he and Marlowe were sitting on the cedar bench. End of the day, the sun going down behind the Highfield, the light coming across the hill and hitting the reservoir and turning the water the particular gold that August does when it is almost over. "The grapes are going to be sold," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "Dad is selling the Highfield.
The whole vineyard. He talked to a buyer last week, a wine company from the coast that wants to expand into the valley. They're offering good money. Marlowe was quiet. She looked at the high field, the long slope of it, the rows of vines that her father had pruned every winter for 50 years, the windbreak of white pine at the top that her great-great-grandfather had planted in 1918. The land that 5 generations of Ashford men had built their identity around. She thought about Hollis, about the way he had walked those rows every morning, the stooped figure, the checking, the absolute faith in the place and the crop. He would have hated that, she said, not angry, just true. I know, Hadley said, but you're the one who showed us the land doesn't have to be what we decided it was. She looked at him. He was young, 21, his whole life in front of him, already holding a piece of truth it had taken her 48 years to learn. The bottom land is the whole farm now, he said, and that's enough. She put her hand on the arm of the bench, the cedar, rough and warm from the afternoon sun. She thought about Eloise, standing at a greenhouse window, writing in a notebook no one was supposed to see, pressing a blossom into a Bible page. She thought about Marin, walking the bottom land in a gray coat, speaking once, being laughed at, and leaving behind a pouch of dried seeds for someone she would never meet. She thought about Willa Prescott's hands, warm, small. The 2 words she had spoken in the back of a room full of people who had spent years looking the wrong direction. Mama knew. And she thought about a bench on a dike. 2 people in the failing light. A notebook read aloud. A voice that had been silent for 30 years, finally filling the air over the water. She looked out at the bog, the reservoir catching the last of the gold, the vine mat low and dark and permanent over the beds, the red-winged blackbirds settling into the hedgerow for the night. This was not the story anyone in Briar Hollow had expected her to tell. Not the story the Ashford family had written for her in the language of grapes and hillside and 5 generations of certainty. Not the story Pemberton had seen in his data. Not the story the community had predicted when they watched the sand trucks and shook their heads. It was a different story. Older, quieter, more patient. The story that the land itself had been telling for 100 years while the people who owned it argued about what it meant. The land tells you what it wants to be, and sometimes the land has to wait a very long time for someone willing to listen. But sometimes, 3 women across a century, a deerskin pouch, a notebook kept in secret, a blossom pressed into a Bible page, hands warm in the back of a room, a bench on a dike in the fading light. Sometimes the listening was always happening, just waiting to become the thing it was always meant to be.